Good evening, everybody. My name is Sherry Lieberman, and I am the president of the Sisterhood of Temple Beth Am. And it is our honor and privilege to work with GableStage, the Zelda Kloner Gift Fund, as well as Heidi Burkess in presenting to you tonight Haunted Waters, the MS St. Louis, Sotto Voce, and the Weight of Memory. I now call on Bari Newport, who is the producing artistic director of GableStage.
Hi, everybody. So tonight, we are honored to be joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright and director Nilo Cruz, and by one of the world's foremost Holocaust scholars, Dr. Michael Berenbaum, founding project director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and director of the Sigi Ziering Institute. Together, they'll be in conversation about Nilo Cruz's play, Sotto Voce, and the real history that haunts it, the story of exile, memory, and the enduring legacy of the MS St. Louis. I'm Bari Newport. I'm the producing artistic director of GableStage Theater Company, and I'm deeply grateful to help guide what promises to be a powerful and timely exchange. Before we begin, I want to extend our sincere thanks to Temple Beth Am Sisterhood and to Heidi Burkess and the Zelda Kloner Gift Fund for their generous sponsorship of tonight's Dramatically Speaking. And thank you to our friends at the Hub for 3 years of meaningful partnership. We are deeply grateful for your support in making these important conversations possible. So, Nilo Cruz, I'm going to read your bio now. Okay. It's a shortened one. Nilo Cruz gained national prominence in 2003 when he won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama for Anna in the Tropics, which also received the Steinberg Award and a Tony Award nomination. His acclaimed body of work includes Two Sisters and a Piano, Lorca in a Green Dress, Hortensia and the Museum of Dreams, Bathing in Moonlight, and many others. With productions seen across the country and around the world, in addition to his plays, Cruz has written opera librettos, including, and I'm so excited about this, The Last Dream of Frida and Diego, which will open at the Metropolitan Opera in May of 2025. And he adapted Anne Patchett's Bel Canto for the Lyric Opera of Chicago. He holds an MFA from Brown University. He's taught at Yale, Brown, NYU, and the University of Iowa, and the University of Miami. Dr. Michael Berenbaum is a distinguished Holocaust scholar, writer, and educator, and the founding project director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He's director of the Sigi Ziering Institute at the American Jewish University and a distinguished professor of Jewish studies. Dr. Berenbaum has held senior leadership roles at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Shoah Foundation, served as executive director of the award-winning Encyclopedia Judaica, and has taught at institutions including Yale, Georgetown, and Wesleyan. His work has been central to shaping how Holocaust history is preserved, studied, and understood worldwide. So, Michael, can you tell us what is the story of the MS St. Louis?
The MS St. Louis sailed in May of 1939. We have to understand what May of 1939 is. It sailed to Cuba. There were 936 passengers on board. 906 of them were Jews. And the people who left Hamburg, on the Hamburg American line, left believing that they had valid visas for Cuba. When they arrived in Cuba, they were told that their visas were no longer valid, and they were left there within sight of the harbor of Havana, and they were left there without a place to go. This created an enormously interesting international incident. It also meant that you had a problem, which is that Cuban officials wanted to be bribed accordingly, And if they were bribed accordingly, they might have accepted these people. Yet the precedent of bribing for every refugee, especially if it were coming out of the charitable funds of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, would have been quite problematic. They sailed, and ladies and gentlemen, we are in Miami. They could see the lights of Miami, hoping that in very real respect, America would open its doors to these refugees. The Coast Guard patrolled the waters to make sure that the ship did not run aground. And then there were all sorts of international negotiations. And the end result was that 4 European countries agreed to accept the refugees. The only ones who got off, who escaped what later became the Holocaust, meaning the killing process, were the Jews who got off in England. Others got off in France, in Holland, and in Belgium, and they all were swept up later on in the Holocaust. 3 things have to be said to understand it. First of all, of the 906 Jews, only, you can't say only, you have to begin to hold your breath when you say that, 250 Jews ended up dying in being killed in the Holocaust. And the reason they were, the number of people was so small in comparison to the full number was because once people decided to leave, they were committed to leave under all circumstances. And you have to presume that those who left on the Hamburg American line, some of them traveling first class, were people who still had some means, and consequently they left, and they then left again and again and again. That says something to our time, because it says that if you're determined to escape oppression, this was a setback, a horrendous setback, but it wasn't the final word. Second thing is, what was 1939? Henry Kissinger said, when my parents left Germany, it took no foresight, merely opportunity. And that is, German Jews had 6 years between 33 and 39 to understand what the circumstances were. And the question was not whether to leave, but how to leave, and equally where to go. Where to go, I can put it to you in a terribly humorous, some people, including historians who deal with the Holocaust, deal with what you would call dark humor. So a fellow was offered the opportunity, he said, the only visa I can get you is Australia, but that's so very far away from here. And he said, I can think of no better recommendation. Think, by the way, of Otto Frank, who left in 1933, but only went to Holland because he thought, what? Holland had been neutral in World War I and would remain neutral in World War II, and he and his family were safe. He didn't understand the circumstances. And the other way to say it is in the words of a man by the name of Walter Lacour, who said, the pessimist left, the optimist stayed and died. Meaning, when do you know you have to leave? And I have to say that the most haunting question I get today as a historian, even from American Jews, is when do I know I have to leave? And that scares the hell out of me. Where does this fit in? What happened between 33 and 39? 1933, the Germans did not develop the Holocaust full form. I'll give you a long answer, but I'll give the context. did not develop the Holocaust full-throatedness. They wanted to get rid of the Jews. They reasoned, if you make it impossible for the Jews to live in Germany as Jews, they will leave. And indeed, by the time the war started, more than 50% of the German Jewish community had left. There were two problems with the strategy of leaving. Number one, nobody wanted to accept the Jews in the numbers in which they had to leave. And the second is Germany did not remain static. It expanded and expanded and expanded, and every time it expanded, it got more Jews in its wake. So 150,000 Jews had left Germany between 1933 and March of 1938. March 1938, Germany invades Austria. It actually captures Austria, it enters Austria. They lifted up the border and they welcomed them, and Adolf Hitler took a ride in an open convertible into the heart of Vienna 3 days after the so-called Anschluss, the invasion. I showed that film in the Holocaust Museum to Bill Clinton, who was visiting when he was President of the United States. He said, if I stood up in a convertible in my hometown, the Secret Service would shoot me. The idea that somebody could stand up in a convertible in a country that they had just occupied was unbelievable. So every time Germany expanded, it got 200,000 Jews in one night in March 1938. When it took over parts of Czechoslovakia in September, got another 90,000 Jews in March of 1939. It got another several 100,000 Jews. By the time they entered Poland, they had gotten more than 2 million Jews. You can't get rid of Jews in that pace. Now, what of American policy? America essentially, and if this sounds deja vu all over again, I want you to hear it. America essentially established quotas in 1924 based on the census of 1890. Now somebody's going to ask the question, why the census of 1890? Because in the words of Congress, it wanted to build the United States along the original racial stock of the American people. And that meant it didn't want Southern Europeans, Italians, Greeks, didn't want Eastern European, Poles, and Russians, included among them were Jews. So it only wanted to receive people in that basis. Germany kept making it more and more difficult for Jews to live in Germany as Jews. By the time that the November pogroms known as Kristallnacht came around, the question was not whether you could live in Germany as a Jew. The question is, where do we go and what does it take to leave? Young left before the old. People with mobile professions left before people who didn't have mobile professions. Example, architects is a mobile profession. Music is a mobile profession. I live in Los Angeles. Movie making is a mobile profession. Acting is a mobile profession. Writers have a problem because they write in language. Lawyers have a problem because they have codes of laws. And interestingly enough, nurses are more mobile than doctors because the licensing requirements for doctors are much more intense. And the other question is, did you have mobile wealth? So I grew up in a community in New York that was comprised of German and Belgian Jews who were in the diamond business. In the diamond business, you could swallow your assets. You could put them, you could put them in a condom and put them in private parts of your body. You could hide them in your clothes. You could put them in your teeth. And people actually did that. So the question becomes the mobile. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but this is a long conversation, let me give it to you in 1 second. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not expend political capital to receive the Jews, even though his wife, and the best way to say it is Eleanor Roosevelt did not influence her husband in the bedroom, but she influenced her husband in the dining room. Meaning she controlled who sat around the table for dinner. And she had advocates for refugees sitting around the table for dinner who had then access to the president to listen. Roosevelt was, let me put it, highly less than generous in expending political capital for Jews. And he had two considerations in 1939, which were pivotal. Number one, he understood in 1939 he was going to run for president again, something nobody else had ever done. And that was going to be an earthquake. Remember, Washington only had 2 terms. Now, after Roosevelt, we have a law: you can't be president, can't be elected president or serve as president more than twice, though that's going to be tested in 2028, apparently. The second thing he understood, and he was lying to the American people, he understood at that point that America was going to get into the war. And he wanted to be explicit that the war had to be a war not for the Jews, because if it was a war for the Jews, nobody would support that war. So he was very careful not to make it about the Jews. And the best way we historians say it is that essentially Germany fought 2 wars: the World War, the racial war, the war against the Jews. We ultimately fought 1 war, which was the World War. So I've given you a long answer, but that should give it to you fairly clearly.
So again, so when the ship then came to Miami, what happened?
Ship was kept off the shores of Miami because they were afraid. The German captain of the ship was phenomenal, and we should mention his name, Captain Schroeder. And he treated the people on board as passengers, guests. And consequently, he tried everything imaginable to keep his passengers happy and to keep his passengers well respected and well treated. And you have to imagine, this is 1939. You've been discriminated against for 6 years. Your wealth has been confiscated. You've been taxed. You've been abused. And doors are open for you. Would you please be seated? Can you have dinner at the captain's table? Ordinary gestures of humanity that are, under these circumstances, extraordinary. Let me read only one paragraph of one thing. I want to read to you a child's game that was played on board. Children played a game in which 2 boys guarded a barrier constructed of chairs. Other children lined up and asked permission to pass through. "Are you a Jew?" asked one of the guards. "Yes," answered the child at the barrier. "Jews are not admitted," snapped the guard. "Oh, please let me in. I'm only a little Jew." This is the consciousness of kids on board. So you have to understand what it takes for children to be playing that game when these parents are trying to protect their children from understanding their fate. And if you want to feel it in your guts, think of this. There were 2 movements to send children out without their parents. One movement was what's called kinder transport, and the other movement was Youth Aliyah. Hadassah-sponsored Youth Aliyah, which sent children, to Palestine. That's not a political statement. historical statement, because it was Palestine at that point. Now, many of you are parents, many of you are grandparents. Imagine for a moment what you have to know about how dire the circumstances, that you love your child so much that you're willing to give your child into the arms of strangers to save that child.
I think I'm going to change my pattern and I'm going to ask you now. So a year ago, you contacted me and you asked if we'd be interested in producing your play Sotto Voce, and I was just thrilled that you reached out, even more thrilled that you agreed to direct it. What made you write this play in the first place? When did the St. Louis and this story first cross your path?
Well, I first learned of the St. Louis not through a book. I actually learned about it at my father's shoe store on 8th Street, Little Havana. I was probably maybe 14 years old. So when my father was not busy selling shoes, his friends would come over and they would talk. And it was during one of the conversations that I learned this saying that is very prevalent. Oh, I guess, I don't know nowadays in Cuba, because I left Cuba 50 years ago. I just revealed my age, I'm sorry. But I remember there was a gentleman that was talking about la maldición de San Luis, the curse of the San Luis. So it's a belief in Cuba that Cubans are cursed because they did not allow these Jewish refugees to enter Cuba. And that stayed with me. And much later, I think it was 2010, I was approached by Mario Ernesto Sanchez, who is an artist, he died last year, may he rest in peace. He had a theater here in Miami, and he asked me to write a play dealing with the San Luis. I didn't want to write about it, to be honest with you, because I'm not Jewish, and I didn't think I should be writing about this tragedy. But then I started to think about how that story stayed with me of when I was a teenager and I heard about La Maldición de San Luis. And then I started to look at my own life and my family's life as well. My father was in prison, got caught leaving the country illegally when I was 2 years old. And he was turned back and was in prison and was in for 2 years. And I didn't get to see my father until I was 4 years old. And then after that, we waited to leave the country, and it took us 6 years to leave the country. So sort of those parallels sort of like stayed with me as well. You were talking about the kindergartens. We have the equivalent in Cuba too with Pedro Pan's children who were also sent to the United States, so they would be protected and they would not be sent to Russia. So there's so many parallels. Mind you, of course, the history of Jews in Europe is devastating, and of course is much more terrifying. But I, just thinking of the parallels, and actually wanting to get the blessing from my Jewish friends as well, like Emily Mann, who ran the McCarter Theater, and she directed many of my plays. Jay Harris as well, who has been a producer of my work. I said, do you think it's acceptable for me to write about this? They said, yes, of course, I do a very good job. So then I entered the world of the San Luis, and I did research. There were many books that came my way, Voyage to the Dam, Refuge Denied, and then I sort of set aside the research and took a more personal journey with the piece. And I usually do this with my work. For instance, this opera you were talking about, The Last Dream of Frida and Diego, it is not a biopic. It deals with Frida Kahlo coming back from the dead on the Day of the Dead, and a dying Diego Rivera. So I take from moments of history, and then I sort of mix it with with fiction. And I created a character, like the character of Bernadette, who had a lover who was in that ship, and that lover was turned away, and then he ended up in a concentration camp and was killed. But that memory of her lover stays with her. You know, the whole concept of memory, which is also very prevalent in the Jewish community, we will never forget, right? So I thought that I wasn't as much interested in writing about the people on the ship, but what was left behind after that ship sailed away, and many people, of course, were killed. So the memory of that was, to me, intriguing. Also, because I was aware of books that were out. For instance, there's a book by Montaner, which was a journalist, writer, Carlo Alberto Montaner, which had to do with the journey to the San Luis, and a character that was not allowed to go into Cuba and then ends up in New York. There's another book by a Cuban writer named The German Girl as well. So there's a lot of information on there, and they had written about it, and I thought, I'm going to approach it in a different way. And so this is how Sotto Voce came around. And one of the things about this play, the biggest honor that I've had, besides getting prizes and all of that, was the blessing of Peter Brook. Peter Brook, who is the guru of American, of world theater, I should say. I was doing the play in New York. The play was reviewed by the New York Times. His wife, Natasha Perry, excellent English actress, read the review. She wanted a play for herself. She was in her 80s around that time. Sent for the play. We sent it to her. She read it, loved it, and Peter was going to direct it. Then she got very ill and died. And then the play had been translated into French. And what Peter was going to do, Peter was going to present the play in all the ports that the refugees were denied entry, which I thought was a beautiful idea. So for me, it was such a great honor, you know, that someone like Peter would engage with my work. But unfortunately, when she died, he called me and said, and I had cleared my schedule to work with this man. When she died, he said, I cannot do it. I cannot direct a play. And if you look at the published version of Sotto Voce, it's dedicated to Natasha and Peter Brook.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah, so I guess, don't worry, there won't be a curse at your theater with this play.
The curse will be lifted, right? By telling the story, the curse gets lifted, I'd imagine.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, it has. It's had life in other theaters, and it's done well, so.
But to tell the story over and over, that's very important, you know? That's why we're all here, is to never forget and to make sure that everybody knows. I came across the St. Louis story when I was in Hebrew school in Stamford, Connecticut, and there was a girl in my class whose grandparents, she was Canadian, were survivors somehow. And that was the first time I encountered this horrific story. How long was the boat ride?
The boat took about 8 or 9 days, if I remember correctly. And then they sailed very, 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 very slowly back to Europe after they were in port for a period of time. I remember it as a week, but I wouldn't swear to it, trying to see if world pressure would do that, trying also to see if if pressure could be brought on the American administration. And then they went back to Europe, and they went back to Europe very, very slowly. And the reason they went back very slowly is because, and this is all due to the captain, because he figured that if he took his time, pressure would build and there would have to be something that would develop to rescue these people, understanding full well and taking a risk for himself, because remember, he was a captain of a German-American ship. German flagship, so he was endangering himself. If he took his time, then that would give the negotiators and the political and Jewish organizational people time to make other arrangements, and that's precisely what was done.
Why did Cuba open its doors in the first place?
Cuba opened its doors for a 5-letter word, M-O-N-E-Y. And the other is you have to understand, these refugees were privileged people who had enormous skills, who would have brought skills to Cuba in doing this. It's interesting who opened their doors to Jews. A bizarre thing, especially in today's geopolitics, faculty members who were dismissed from German universities, Jewish faculty members, were invited to Turkey. Turkey, after the Spanish Inquisition, sent ships to Spain to bring the Jews to Spain because they had brought with them the printing press and steel, as well as trade. Turkey here used Jewish faculty to revamp architecture, to revamp music, to develop theater. Some incredible books in literature, Mimesis by Eric Orbach, which is a classical volume of a study of literature, was written in Turkey, and they joked that they had the best German university outside of Germany because they recruited these people. This was an elite group who could have contributed. Think also of the very fact that the scientists who came to the United States, discarded by Hitler's Europe, were the scientists who developed the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project. I mean, enormous scientific talent. So Cuba would have stood to benefit from this, but whatever they would stand to benefit was not going into the pockets of the type of officials that were in charge of policy at that point. And they wouldn't be the first Cubans who didn't think of national interest as much as they thought of how do we use political power to line our own pockets. Not that something like that could ever happen in the United States. In fact, let me take that back and not insult Cuba. They wouldn't be the first political officials who thought in terms of what can I do to line my pockets, and national interest plays a secondary role.
How did you come up with the title Sotto Voce? Which means, I think, under the breath?
Yeah. I think, I was interested more in the voice under the voice. The character of the main character, who was a writer, she was so terrified, and sort of that memory of that chapter in the world sort of stayed with her, and she hasn't been able to write about it or her life. And so there's this young man that appears in her life who's Jewish, a Sephardic Jew coming from Cuba, modern times, the year 2000. She's 80 years old now, and he is doing research on the survivors or the passengers of the San Luis, and he knows of her and that she had a lover that was in the ship, and so he starts to do a series of investigations. They never get to meet in person. There are all these communication, all this dialogue is done through the phone. And somehow this young man is able to get information from her, and she begins to write the story that she's never been able to write. So the whole concept of the voice, that voice that she hears on the phone, the concept of trying to dialogue the living with the dead was also very intriguing to me. In a way, how would you speak to the dead? And probably in a very whispery voice. That was a metaphor as well for the concept of Sotto Voce. And sort of the dance between the past and the present, choreography in time, the past and the present, also, which I think would be done in a very whispery way. So, yeah, that's how the title stayed with me, and it's said to call the place of the watcher.
I mean, I've always, I describe the language of theater as the language of metaphor. That's the language that theater speaks in. And what's so amazing about your work, first of all, you're an incredible poet, but your theatrical work is so poetic in its form that you really know the language of theater and use it beautifully to tell not only this story, but every story that I've read or seen of yours. You use metaphor and poetry to bring it to life in the heart.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a play that just closed here in Miami, at Miami New Drama. Here There Are Blueberries, a fantastic play, which deals a lot with history, a documentary sort of oriented play. I can't do documentary theater. For me, and I admire it, and I love Moises, and I love all those people who do that kind of work. For me, I start with history, and then I sort of step away from it and sort of create. The history becomes the background of the play, and I start involving, being engaged more with the emotional life of the characters. To me, I think if historians deal with the bones of history, writers like me deal with the breadth of history. And so I'm interested in the emotional life of the characters more than anything. And that's how I create my work. So again, the history is the background, and then somehow that becomes, it's a way of entering the play.
Why is it important to keep this specific story alive in contemporary civic dialogue?
You know, I'm going to answer that in a wide thing, but briefly. My dream would be to be irrelevant. I'd like to live in a world where what I know about evil had nothing to do with the present, where what I know about indifference has nothing to do with the present, where I know about the cold, calculating response to people in deep and profound need as a matter of life and death has no contemporary resonance. That, unfortunately, is not the world I live in. You speak in theater, I speak in museum speak. We struggled with the question, how do you end the Holocaust Museum? And you know, how do you end the play? And somebody who had built major cities said, you gotta end it with Anne Frank's quote, above all, I believe that man is good at heart. And we said, yeah, but the problem is the Holocaust is no proof of that. It's proof of the opposite. In Jerusalem, you could end the museum by opening out to the pristine forest of the Jerusalem forest. How do we end it in Washington? The ideal ending would be to say that's what 20th century humanity did. That's what tyranny, that's what oppression, that's what totalitarian governments did. We could not do that. Couldn't happen in our world. Never again would be a reality. So my problem is I wish there were no resonance. Let me give you Twain once said there are truth, lies, and statistics. So let me give you an interesting statistic. In November 1938, there was what we call Kristallnacht, which is a fancy term, and they now call it the November pogroms. Because Crystal is beautiful, the pogroms are, what shall we say, a little bit less beautiful. So the American people were 90% against what happened on the November pogroms. We had already embodied the notion of religious freedom and civility and interreligious discourse, and synagogues should be able to exist in the world in the way in which churches exist, etc., etc. There was less than a 2% change in the attitude toward receiving immigrants. You could hate what the Nazis were doing, but that's a problem there, not a problem here. And Miami's a city of immigrants. Miami's a world of immigrants, and the idea that we're close-hearted and cruel to immigrants, again, is something that's remarkable. Even if you're close-hearted, why the hell be cruel? And here you have that. So I wish that this had no resonance. It has deep and profound resonance. And let me tell you, one of the largest questions in the world today is, can democratic governments solve problems, or are they going to be so polarized that one is going to look for a strong leader and get rid of the checks and balances, constraints and restraints, and the peculiar tensions of a democratic society, and opt for an authoritarian and ultimately a totalitarian regime? So I wish I was irrelevant and I could speak about ancient history.
I wanted to add that one of the reasons why I decided to not just set the play in 1939, but also in the year 2000, is because I find that history keeps on repeating itself. And it feels like every generation comes up with their own San Luis. And it's actually happening now. So, I mean, people trying to cross the border, crossing, deserts, or coming on a boat. And so when I saw that repetition, and of course it happened in my own country, and it continues to happen. So I thought, no, I have to set it in more present times, and I can't say what the 2000 will be the most present, because otherwise my dad would be like almost like what, maybe like 100 years old, like 90, and so and I had to think of actors, right? Memory after a certain amount of time starts to falter. So
why did you reach out to me at that time? Why did you think, let's do this play here?
Well, I mean, I was seeing, the resurfacing of hatred towards Jews.
A year ago, yes.
Yeah, in this country, and of course in other parts of the world as well. And I felt the urgency to say, we need to do this now. And I kept telling my agent, let's go, let's do this, let's do the play. So I immediately said to you, would you consider this play? Would you read it? Because I felt the urgency that it has to be done, it has to be seen in the world again.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is the first full English production in Miami.
Yes, in Miami. It was done in Spanish before, but this is the first time it's done in English, yes.
I'd like to open up to questions from our audience. Maybe with a little house light. Yes.
I would like to ask the doctor what he's telling his family and himself about
I'm coming to you.
Yeah, if we could have the house lights up a bit, please.
I would like to ask the doctor, when it's time to leave, what are you telling your family members and yourself, especially after what went on in Australia?
When it's time to leave.
I think we're in the 1920s, not the 1930s. And that is that we still have a chance, and a strong chance, to turn things around, but the venom of anti-Semitism is deep, and we see it's worldwide. And the other thing about, and I just gave a lecture on this in Miami about a month ago. The second question I get is I get 3 questions. How do I get a second citizenship? And I'm dealing, my wife's friends are here, and I spoke to one of their friends, Carrie, who said, I just received my German citizenship.
Wow.
And she said, my father would be turning over in his grave
That's a play, Nilo, that's a play.
100-fold if he understood how happy I was to receive German citizenship, because that's the country that threw him out. And then the third question is, where do you go? But I think, I believe very deeply that there is time to turn America around, and we can overcome look, anti-Semitism is a whack-a-mole. You hit it here, it pops up there, it's got all sorts of other forms. But we don't have to be as cruel, as evil, as awful, as polarized, and as ineffective as we are. We can do better. And we have to do that. But that doesn't minimize the danger of this moment in history.
Let me ask you a question, a little off the topic, but the Muslims probably for 1,500 years have had a long view of taking over the world, which they tried way back in the 1500s. And the situation has occurred pretty much in Europe at this point in time, and we have a situation now in this country beginning. And what is your feeling about that?
Let me put it to you differently, which is, if I had been a Jew in history any time except in the last 80 years, and had a choice to live under Muslim domination or under Christian domination, and I say this as a historian, I would choose to live under no domination. But if I had a choice, I would live under Muslim domination. And that is that the history of Muslim-Jewish relations are significantly better than the history of Christian-Jewish relations, with the exception of what's happened in the last 80 years in the aftermath of the Holocaust, when Christianity has transformed itself with regard to the Jews, because civility into the interreligious world has taken place. So when I look at Islam, I look at a couple of things that you have to look at, which is, are there groups of Muslims who have now assimilated enough to accept the civility that is part of the interreligious discourse of the world? Example, you had the horrific event in Pittsburgh of the Pittsburgh 11 killed at the Tree of Life. The most interesting thing is what the response of the community was afterwards. And that is, you all know that you had the Pittsburgh Gazette, had the Kaddish on its front page, that the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Pittsburgh Penguins put a Jewish star on. And the Muslim community in Pittsburgh gave $250,000 immediately to help rebuild the Tree of Life synagogue. Take a look at what happened in Australia this past week, which is that the imam in Australia deeply and profoundly criticized what had happened and said it was anti-Islam. Now, that does not mean that there's not a significant segment of Islam that is radicalized and virulently politically anti-Jewish, but we have, and not only anti-Israel, but anti-Jewish. But Islam and Judaism, and here I speak philosophically, Islam and Judaism have significantly less antagonism historically than Christianity and Judaism. The Muslims believe we're wrong, not that we're evil. And we have no sense of having murdered God, no sense of the blood libel, no sense of any of that. So there are things to build upon. Let me also say politically, and why do the Abraham Accords exist? And this is critically, and I hate to talk about contemporary politics, but let me say one thing, and you can throw the darts in a couple of minutes. But the Abraham Accords exist for a very simple reason, which is that there are segments of the Arab world that have recognized that we've moved to a knowledge-based economy. Remember, some of you are old enough to remember the aftermath of the 1973 war. 1973 Yom Kippur War, we were afraid that the future of power in the world would be in the control of natural resources. We have discovered in the last 50 years that the future of the world is in knowledge-based economy, in the ability to get your hands around knowledge, and it's going to only increase with AI as the capacities increase. In that, Israel has become not a liability, but an asset. And the other thing that happened in the Middle East, which you have to pay attention to, is that Israel has now solved what is the most significant problem in Iran today, which is not nuclear weapons, but water. They may have to move out of Tehran because they've run out of water by mismanagement. And Israel and I can give it to you in a crazy statistic. Israel recycles 87% of its water. California, which has a drought. You guys in Miami don't know what it's like not to have rain on a regular basis. I could put my convertible top down in April, don't have to put it up until October, and have no reason whatsoever to put it down anywhere in between. Israel recycles 87% of the water, California 17%. Israel now produces enough water to be able to provide water to Saudi Arabia and provide water to Jordan and to the Palestinians and the like, because it's engaged in cheap desalinization. So it solved that. Therefore, alliances are being formed by elements. Now, if you go to a knowledge-based economy, I have bad news for you, which is you can't build a knowledge-based economy on only 50% or 48% of your population. You have to use women's brains as well. Not because you want to. God forbid you don't want smart women, but because you can't build it on 50% of your population. That's a seismic change in the world. And even Saudi Arabia, despite its brutality and the like, is moving to push its women allow its women and encourage its women to do this, participate in the larger world. So that gives me a drop of optimism, despite the radical manifestations, the horrific manifestations of radical Islam. But remember, with 1,500,000,000, if 5% of the population is radicalized, that's a hell of a lot of people and a very dangerous situation, and we can't minimize the danger, but look at other trends that are struggling with that, and we see a much more complex world. And remember, I'm a pessimist by nature. And that is, if you prepare for the worst, everything else is much better.
For you, sir, the principal architect of America's deportation and anti-refugee policy is Jewish, or at least of Jewish origins. We have significant Jewish support for Trump's administration, whose primary objective is deportation and being an anti-refugee. What has happened to our community in light of things like the St. Louis, that we find ourselves split and divided on issues of basic humanity?
Hayes had a wonderful saying, and I want to look at this audience and say that many of you can trace your arrival in the United States to assistance that your ancestors received from Hayes, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Hayes's phrase I want you to listen to was, we used to receive refugees because we used to fight for refugees because they were Jewish, and now we fight for refugees because we are Jewish. And look, the Catholic Church is also undergoing a significant thing, because the Catholic Church is a refugee church. I don't have to tell you that living in Miami. It's a refugee church. It's a significant number of the priests are Hispanic, a very significant number of the priests are Hispanic, and the parishes in the United States have been filled for generations with refugees. And consequently, they are asking themselves as well, what happens? We have a tension, and there are people who are acting out of different imperatives. The right is interested in, the extreme right is now manifesting itself, interested in creating a white Christian nation, and they're not even faking it by saying Judeo-Christian. Now, as a scholar, I would say Judeo-Christian was an American invention. Beautiful American invention. And in the 1950s, there was a book by Will Herberg called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. We were 3% of the American population. We were 33% of the American religious experience. That's not the case. And that goes back to your point, sir, which is that now if you talk about American religious life, you have to talk about Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu, right? And all of the variety of Eastern religions all the way through. So we are now, and the question becomes the endangerment of the dominant culture, and you just had a national security survey which spoke about what's happening in Europe with the endangerment of the dominant culture. And pluralism is hard. Pluralism is hard. Jews have always thrived in a pluralistic, multicultural society. That's why we thrived in the United States. And I can tell you the history of, I can tell you the history of Poland. I can tell you the history of 9 different countries in which, when they were pluralistic and multicultural, the Jews thrived, because one of the things about us as a community, as a Jewish community, is that we were the agents of globalization before there was ever that concept. And the reason for that is something very interesting in history, which is, for globalization to succeed, you need 2 elements. You need law and you need credit. And Jews were able to give each other credit, and because they operated with a system of law, they were able to engage in trade. You want to know it historically? Maimonides, the greatest Jewish philosopher in history, who was also a physician, his brother died at sea as what? As a man who was an exporter and importer, bringing stuff from India. Why could he bring stuff from India? Because Jews had mobility and they could communicate with each other before we lived in a unified world. So we have enormous dangers in our society. We have people, and I have to say that, I'll just conclude with this. I'm on a hobby horse now. I want my right-wing friends to criticize right-wing anti-Semitism, and I want my left-wing friends to criticize left-wing anti-Semitism. And the reason for that is because it's cheap to criticize the other guy without criticizing yourself. Now, we have one great advantage, which may be a measure of safety in the United States, which is that if you think of left and right as polarized, they generally can also draw together on the hatred side of it, but what keeps them apart is the issue of immigration, which is they can't join forces because the dividing point becomes immigration. And we're fortunate for that, because otherwise they could draw together. So I, who lives a little bit on the left wing, want to criticize left wing anti-Semitism, and the people I want to criticize right wing anti-Semitism are the people who pay a price when they criticize right wing anti-Semitism, which is people on the right.
So, my question is for Mr. Cruz. So I also grew up in Little Havana, and I felt like a lot of the anti-Semitism I personally faced, granted this was a couple years ago, was mostly just due to ignorance within the Cuban American community towards Jewish culture in general. How much, have you received any pushback from your own community on this? And how much have you focused on educating your own community on this issue and the rising anti-Semitism in this country?
No, I haven't received any kind of backlash from the community, but one of the reasons that I also reach out to Bari is because nowadays we forget that, for instance, I am the child of immigrants, but also the grandson of immigrants as well. So I'm baffled by Cubans in Miami right now, and the fact that they forget that they were exiles, and their policies towards everything that's going on politically in this country right now in regards to immigrants, they sort of forget their history. And I think one of the questions that this play asks is that if you see a ship of refugees after seeing the play, would you turn your back on them?
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, yeah. This lady, and then I'll come back to you.
I have a much more factual question. One of the pieces of literature that both of you have mentioned, I have read, and I had some understanding that some of the refugees on the St. Louis were admitted to Cuba. Is that correct?
There were about a handful of refugees who were admitted to Cuba. There were a handful of refugees who were admitted to Cuba. There also were scenes on the ship of fathers chartering, motorboats and going out to the ship for a view of their wife and their children, which is that they had already pre-existence. Remember, immigration very often is a process I don't, if I asked you to tell your immigrant story, my grandfather came here and then sent for his wife. And I'll tell you a second story. I got my PhD, and my immigrant grandfather came up to me and said, "Michael, let me teach you to be a butcher." And I didn't appreciate what he was offering me. I said, "Zelda, a butcher?" He said, no, you don't understand something. I've never been afraid of being unemployed. I've lived in 7 countries, and if I lost my job on a Tuesday, on Thursday I had a job, because people always have to eat. And in the arrogance of my youth, I didn't appreciate that. But now I really appreciate, and I'm not going to be a butcher. I would have cut off my fingers in all sorts of ways. Though I have to tell you that my grandfather being a butcher got me through rabbinical school, because I was the only one who had been to a slaughterhouse and could name all of the parts which I had read of. And my teachers couldn't believe how much I knew, and I didn't know it from the books. I knew it because I kept trying to say, I can't memorize this in the abstract, I got to see it in the concrete. So when I went to rabbinical school, I did brilliantly well on those exams because I had finally seen all of the parts of the animals and could tell which was which. But my grandfather was telling me something about the type of skills you need to survive as an immigrant. But some people came over in full families. Some people came over, one person came over. You announced I'm the Sigi Ziering professor. Sigi Ziering's father came to England seeking to bring his wife and his children over to England from Germany. They ended up going to Riga and being shipped out of Germany to Riga, being in a concentration camp in Kaiserwald, while his father was in England and had developed enormous resources, had been successful in England, had all the money that he possibly could need, but no capacity to save his family. They ended up surviving due to the brilliance of Sigi Ziering's mother, but you have all of these elements that were part of the immigration story, and we have people coming over like this. And my parents were the equivalent of dreamers. My mother came here at 6 months of age. My father came here at 6 years of age. And my grandmother of blessed memory said anybody who speaks nostalgically of Europe, the Europe I lived in, should go back there.
This for Mr. Cruz. Given do you see any possibility of the Cuban government changing its attitude to the story of St. Louis? Given the example of Armando Lucas Correa's encounter with the Cuban authorities, that is the author of the German girl that you mentioned, encounter with the Cuban authorities when he brought in the books during the Havana book fair to Cuba, and the books were not allowed to be distributed, but they were actually forbidden to be not only translated or published in Cuba, but even to get any kind of foothold in Cuba at all. Is there a chance for the change that would allow maybe your play to be staged in Cuba, and where, say, Vanessa Garcia would be able to write a different story about the book fairs in the future in Havana or Cuba?
It's curious for your question, because my character, Sakiel, in the play, is doing all the research to actually bring attention to the Cuban government that the Cuban government never apologized for what it did. And so that's what he's after in the play, is gathering the testimonies of all the people to bring attention to the subject matter. Do I think it's gonna happen? No. No, because Cuba, I shouldn't say Cuba, but the current government in Cuba tries to erase a lot of the history. They're not interested in it. They're only interested in what they have, in the system they have established. One of the things that intrigued me in writing this play is to give a platform. To theater is a way of welcoming stories and presenting stories. In my play, the apartment of the main character becomes a port. That's one of the metaphors. We were talking about metaphor symbols in my play. The apartment becomes this port in which we can dialogue with the past and also revisit the past, so maybe perhaps that past will not be repeated again. My work has only been done in Cuba once with a very safe play, which has to do with Anna in the Tropics. I don't think it's a safe play, but it has to do with 1929 and cigar rollers and cigar factories, which they still have readers reading a literature to cigar workers. That was the play that was done there. There's another play of mine that's very popular, and I actually think is one of my best scripts, is Two Sisters and a Piano, about women under house arrest in Cuba who are communist, but they want they're socialists, but they want changes within the system. But there's something in Cuba, that Fidel said that you can criticize anything but the revolution. But these women want changes within the system, and as a result, they're in prison and then are under house arrest. So that would have been the perfect play to have staged in Cuba, but of course they did not look at that. They did not stage it. But I did give permission. I did get a lot of flack for allowing Anna in the Tropics to be done in Havana. But I'm interested in dialogue. So I thought, yes, why not? Our lives didn't just end in Cuba. I came to this country. I educated myself in this country, went to a very good university. I'm established playwright. I make a living off of writing, which is very difficult to do. My work is not just known in this country, but it's known internationally. But they felt that's the only story that they could produce there, which had to do with tradition. But it also had to do, Two Sisters and a Piano, as a matter of fact, also has to do with censorship, censoring books. And of course, that's something that we know that's still present in Cuba, and more so during the 80s, when it's the time, and 90s when the play takes place. But it's interesting because this play, Two Sisters and a Piano, is being done in this country. Often it was actually done 2 years ago here in Miami, because we are encountering censorship again. We're censoring writers, we're censoring books.
And history.
And history, absolutely.
Let me say two things on that. Number one of the villains in what happened in Cuba is Batista. And the Cuban government would have an easier time describing this if you begin to understand the role of Batista. The second is I want to, I'm going to say two other things. Number one, when we created the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, we had no political interference whatsoever from the American government as to the content of the museum. And we said some nasty things about the American government and its refusal and its indifference. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is going to open a new exhibition sometime in the medium-term future, and one wonders if they will be able to say the same thing without interference, except that it was a democratic regime, that it was a democratic Roosevelt regime that turned its back. But the idea of accepting refugees and all of that. The last thing I want to say is I had a doctoral student who got his doctorate because of one line in his doctoral dissertation, which, and I turn to you because you have to understand it. He wrote a line that was so brilliant that we overlooked the rest of the doctoral dissertation. But he said, why is it that in Russia, we're not talking about Soviet Union, but in the history of Russia, why is it the greatest moral figures in Russia are novelists? And he said, in a world in which truth is not possible, only those who write fiction can tell the truth. And I'm telling you, that's the only reason the guy got the doctorate. And I would stand by it today. I would stand by it today. And you have to tell, and then he went into detail, you have to tell fiction in such a way that you're so bloody smart that the censor doesn't understand how much truth you are telling. And there's an entire book on this called, by Leo Strauss, called Persecution and the Art of Writing. And I'm beginning to think that we may be getting there in our own way, in world culture now. Leo Strauss says, in order to understand what a person said, you have to understand what they were permitted to say in the world in which they wrote. And it's a dialogue between the truth that you have to say and the freedom that you have to say what you have to say. And if that seems a little bit surrealistic, we may get there. I hope not.
Maybe one final question?
Here you go.
Yes. First of all, I want to compliment the director of the GableStage for putting together this. This is fantastic. Second of all, in light of a recent New York Times article on the downturn in regional theaters of attendance and income, what can be done to increase the attendance and income of the now renamed Wolfson GableStage?
GableStage at the Wolfson Family Theater, yes. We are
I stand correct.
privileged to have received a transformational gift, but to name our current space at the Biltmore. I don't know, ever since I was, I was a child actor. You were talking about the Goodspeed Opera House. I mean, that's where I started. And ever since I can remember, it's been the downturn of regional theater, and I just have always, I don't know what you think of this, but I've just always kind of, like Rhoda sent me, I can't tell you how many people sent me that article today. And it was the first thing I read this morning, and my first response was, another one. From the beginning of time, theater has been a very expensive art form because it's all manpower heavy. We can't reproduce ourselves over and over and sell it to the world. We have to be there every night. That's part of the beauty of it. And it's always been an expensive art form. We've always been the people's art form, meaning that we tell human stories in one of the simplest ways to understand the truths of the human experience, whether through a fictionalized story or not, right? We've always prevailed, and I have to believe both through Jesse Wolfson's recent gift and through the generosity of each and every one of you sitting in this room And in the case of GableStage, increased numbers, the highest subscriber count that we've had ever. Things are pointing forward. I believe in, as much of a pessimist as I am, I'm an optimist in this way, and I believe that if we continue to do good work, have an incredible team of people doing this, both on our trustee level, many of whom are here tonight, but also our incredible staff, that good old-fashioned hard work and good work goes a long, long way. I don't know, I believe in it.
And next time you go to the theater, bring your children and your grandchildren. And because let me tell you something, that the younger generation is now not going out, they're going in, and they're expecting everything to come to them on the screen. And we have to reverse that. And we really have to reverse that by showing them what the exciting thing is to be in a live theater production with other people who are laughing with you, who are crying with you, who are scared with you, who are touched by you. It can't only be us old folks.
It's true, we are facing, I mean, it is true. We are facing an existential change, right? I mean, thank God the baby boomer generation is enormous, because we have a couple more years, but the philanthropic support of this generation has really kept the American sector going all these years, and we're not seeing the same philanthropic support in the next generation. Totally concur, though. That's very, very important. There's so many times that somebody's mother will move, or the child will call and say, I need to get rid of my mother's subscription. And we're always like, no, you should have it. But they don't think that way. So yes, bring your kids. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I think we should bring schools to see the plays and educate them early on.
They are coming to Sotto Voce.
They're coming to Sotto Voce. Even when we were doing, and my friend is here, and who was in Anna in the Tropics. When we were doing Anna in the Tropics at
Miami New Drama,
the school board censored my play. Yeah. Because of nudity and.
They censored this one too.
Yeah, they censored this one too. But you know, so I went and I spoke to them and I said, now we're not actually just censoring my lines, but the play, there's some excerpts in the play that deal with Tolstoy. And that's when I went up in arms, because I thought, well, you can censor my work, but not Tolstoy. But I went to them and I said, well, come to the rehearsal. Do you think I'm going to do the play the same way I wrote it 20 years ago? And maybe I was more intrigued by sexuality on stage. Now I'm not. And so come see the rehearsals. And then there were certain lines that they had difficulty with, and I said, you know what? I will cut those lines. The thing is to get those students to the theater to experience
which is what you said about this one too.
By the way, the other thing on this is we can't let schools cut out the drama program.
Yeah.
We just, school systems claim they got this, that, the other thing. Can't let them cut out the drama program. Let me tell you one story. I had the enormous privilege, maybe 30, 35 years ago, maybe even longer than that, of taking Miep Gies, who was the woman who worked with the Otto Frank and Anne Frank thing, taking her throughout the United States. And one of the things that I found, which was incredible, is that women from age 16 to 80 came up to her and invaded her private space immediately, because they had either played her or they had played Anne Frank. And they presumed that because they knew her, she knew them. And I saw the impact of theater. And an 80-year-old woman had played that play 50 years ago, 60 years ago, but still living the thing. And it was interesting how they wanted a touch. They wanted to do this. And I said, asked Mick Gies, said, how often does this happen to you? He says, every minute of every day. And you know, if you do theater, you then are fascinated by theater. And it becomes a lifetime. So don't let schools knock out the drama. That's not an insignificant part of their education. It's very important, and it's been with us for as long as human beings have attempted to be civilized.
Thank you all so much for coming. Sotto Voce, and you're going to be able to see it because you're coming back, but Sotto Voce starts rehearsal in 2 weeks, can you believe it? January 23rd through February 15th, and we have at least one cast member here. Claudia is here, right here, making her GableStage debut. So I look forward to seeing you all at the theater. Thank you.